You're just a wallet with a heartbeat, Daniel, and without us, you'd still be nothing." My sister sneered across the crowded steakhouse, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses and the stunned silence that followed, while my father's hand squeezed her shoulder like he was proud of her for finally saying out loud what the rest of them had whispered for years. And around us, other diners shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to hear while others looked right at me with that particular pity that feels worse than laughter, the kind that says you should have known better than to expect love from people like this. And though my cheeks burned, I sat very still because explosions only feed the fire, and I wanted them to think I was empty, broken, harmless. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name's Daniel Reed. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and after 2 decades of brutal hours building my software company from the ground up, I thought I'd earned not just money, but respect, maybe even gratitude, but instead my family learned how to weaponize my loyalty. And this moment, this public little crucifixion, was just the loudest expression of a truth I'd been ignoring for too long. What they didn't know, and what I wasn't about to say then, was that I'd been carrying a quiet edge all this time. A kind of insurance that none of them could imagine. And though I let them see me chew my steak in silence that night, inside I was rolling the first stone downhill, the one that would eventually bring the mountain crashing onto them. They always loved to mock my sentimental streak, the way I insisted we pass around that old silver fountain pen at family holidays, so each person could scribble something in the leather journal I kept on the mantel, calling it Daniel's fake tradition. But to me, it had weight. It was proof of continuity, a line connecting us even when the rest of life frayed, and while they mocked it, they always signed. Because deep down they knew what a signature could mean, and later they'd learn it meant far more than they bargained for. Back then, though I sat in that restaurant, every word sinking like a nail into my chest, remembering the years I paid for my brother's rehab, my sister's tuition, my parents' mortgage, and the endless vacations they justified as family time that always seemed to end with me footing the bill. And I wondered how I'd ever missed the fact that I wasn't family to them, just financing. And even as my father raised his glass and said, "To Daniel, the banker with no bank," drawing another cruel ripple of laughter, I kept my eyes low, and I whispered inside myself the vow that would change everything. If they saw me as a wallet, then they were about to find out what happens when the wallet snaps shut. The weeks that followed that dinner stretched out like a bad dream, each day heavy with the weight of that humiliation, and yet to the outside world, I kept my smile fixed, kept showing up at the office in downtown Columbus with pressed shirts and practiced charm, shaking hands, making deals, because nothing fuels gossip like a man unraveling, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. But inside, every time my phone buzzed with another emergency from my family, I felt the slow burn harden into something colder, sharper, almost surgical in its patience, because I knew if I pushed too fast, they'd scatter like rats, and I wanted them all together when the hammer fell. My brother Matt, the self-proclaimed entrepreneur who hadn't worked a legitimate day in years, was the first to circle back, calling late at night with his voice dripping false humility, asking if I could front him just another 50 grand to get the business rolling, as if I hadn't already covered his last 3 failed ventures, and I told him I'd think about it, playing my role as the weary but forgiving brother while quietly recording every word, every promise, because paper trails matter, and I knew the day would come when his own words would be his undoing. My sister Lauren doubled down on her cruelty, sending me texts with thinly veiled barbs about how she and her husband deserved the family lake house since they were the ones with kids who'd actually use it, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd been the one paying the property taxes for a decade. And when I reminded her of that, she simply replied with a laughing emoji. As though mocking me digitally wasn't quite enough, she wanted the record to show her contempt. My parents played their part too, inviting me over for Sunday dinners not because they wanted me there, but because they wanted me to hear about how Matt was going to take over the family finances soon, how Lauren's husband was handling the property deeds. Little jabs designed to remind me that my role was ending, that the control I thought I had was already being handed over, and I'd smile politely while cutting into pot roast, but my stomach turned at the thought of the signatures, the documents, the casual theft dressed up as tradition. The pen on the mantel came out once more that Thanksgiving, passed around like it always was, and though they laughed and scribbled something meaningless as they always did, I noticed the way Lauren's husband scrawled his full name without reading the page, The way Matt signed with his usual sloppy flourish, and I held back my own smile, because they didn't realize that the book had changed, that what they thought was another meaningless exercise had quietly become something far more binding, and one day, they'd wish they had paid attention. But patience is a cruel friend, and as I let weeks slide into months, they pushed harder, sensing weakness, calling me out in group texts, mocking me openly at gatherings, and then came the hardest blow: my mother herself, standing in front of cousins and neighbors at Christmas, announcing with false cheer that the Reed family would be better off with Daniel stepping back, her voice sugary but her eyes glinting with the same ruthless greed that had taken root in all of them. And though the room buzzed with whispers, I just stood there, wine glass trembling slightly in my hand, letting them think they'd won, because only I knew that the timer was ticking, and the noose they thought they'd tied around my neck was, in truth, dangling right above theirs. By January, the storm was no longer silent. It was roaring through my life in headlines and paperwork, because Matt, with his lazy charm and crooked grin, had somehow convinced my parents to co-sign documents that moved significant portions of the family trust under his management. And when I confronted them about it, they laughed in my face, saying I was overreacting, that family assets belonged to all of us, as though my 2 decades of carrying them was nothing more than a warm-up for their real inheritance. And I remember walking out into the icy night air, the wind cutting through my coat, thinking how strange it was that betrayal didn't feel like fire anymore. It felt like snow, quiet, suffocating, inevitable. Lauren added to the avalanche, parading her plans for the lake house renovation, posting architectural sketches on Facebook like she already owned the deed, tagging me in the comments with jokes about how my investment had finally paid off, and I realized then that they weren't just stealing, they were erasing me piece by piece until I'd be nothing but a punchline in their stories of victory. And yet, in their arrogance, they overlooked details, the small rituals they had mocked for years, the journal and the pen, the signatures scrawled without thought, each one tucked neatly into the leather-bound pages they barely glanced at, because who takes seriously the sentimental traditions of the fool they'd already written off? I spent late nights in my office surrounded by those pages, scanning each one, cross-referencing dates and contexts, aligning them with documents I'd been quietly drafting in the background. Contracts that only needed one piece to become binding, a signature. And they had given me that again and again, thinking it a joke, not realizing that every careless mark was a nail in their own coffin. But timing was everything, and the real trap wasn't ready yet, because I needed one final push, one event where every player would be present, their egos swollen, their defenses down, and fate handed it to me when Lauren announced the grand family reunion in March. A celebration of legacy, she called it, her way of staging a public coronation for herself and Matt, complete with invitations to distant relatives and business partners, the kind of gathering where reputations would be made and destroyed. In the weeks leading up, they stripped me of the last visible symbols of control, transferring the family accounts, excluding me from group emails, even drafting a speech where my only role was to be thanked for my years of support, like some aging sponsor being gently ushered off stage. I played along, smiling when Lauren rehearsed lines in front of me, pretending not to notice Matt's drunken boasts about how he was finally the man of the family, even letting my father sit me down one evening and explain, with patronizing calm, that stepping aside was the honorable thing to do, as though he were blessing me with mercy instead of stabbing me with betrayal. But what none of them knew was that the journal was already with my lawyer, that the signatures had already been authenticated, and that the contracts, woven together from those very pages, now bore their legally binding consent to the transfer of assets, not to themselves, but back to me. The final flourish, though, the one detail that made me almost giddy in the quiet of my preparation, was that Lauren's grand reunion, the event meant to humiliate me in front of everyone, would also be the perfect stage for the reveal. Because nothing tastes sweeter than justice served under the same lights they intended to burn you with. Back then, I don't think they realized how dangerous it is to mock a man who built everything from nothing, a man who already knows how to survive alone, because when you strip him of family, all you leave him with is clarity, and clarity is the sharpest blade. The reunion fell on one of those early March evenings where Ohio can't decide if it's winter or spring, the air carrying both the bite of frost and the smell of wet earth. And as I pulled into the driveway of the country club they'd rented, I could already hear the laughter spilling out from the ballroom, the sound of my own bloodline celebrating the coronation of my replacement, And for a moment, I sat in the car staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, wondering how many times I had been the fool walking into their stage scenes, always paying the bill, always smiling on cue. And then I thought of that silver pen, the weight of it in my hand year after year, and I felt a stillness settle over me, the calm before detonation. Inside, the chandeliers glared. The buffet tables groaned under the weight of food paid for with my accounts. And everywhere I turned, I caught whispers, eyes that flicked toward me with smirks, as though they already knew my role tonight was to be the punchline. My sister swept to the microphone first, dazzling in her dress, announcing how this was a new chapter for the Reed family. Her words rehearsed, every syllable dripping with triumph, and when she thanked me for all the years of generosity, I heard a low chuckle ripple through the crowd, a communal confirmation that the wallet with a heartbeat had finally been retired. Matt followed, sloppy with whiskey confidence, declaring himself the man steering the family ship now. His grin wide as the room erupted in applause. And then, like a cruel encore, my father took the mic, his voice steadier, colder, announcing that the trust, the properties, the accounts were in good hands with the next generation, as if reading my death sentence in public. I let the silence linger after he spoke, let their applause fade into the hum of clinking glasses, and then I stood, walking slowly to the front, ignoring their sighs, their rolled eyes, their muttered jokes, and when I reached the microphone, I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "If you're all so proud of signatures, let's take a look at a few of them." I held up the leather journal, its pages thick with years of ink, and I watched confusion flicker, then annoyance, then unease as I flipped through the entries, showing page after page of their own handwriting, their own carelessly scrawled names beneath what they thought were silly traditions. "You laughed at this pen," I said softly, holding it up, "but every mark you made with it was binding, every signature witnessed, dated, authenticated, and tied to contracts you never bothered to read." A murmur broke through the room, rising into a storm of questions, but I kept my eyes locked on Lauren, on Matt, on my father, watching color drain from their faces as I explained how those signatures had been stitched into documents, transferring assets not to them, but back to me, ironclad and irreversible. Gasps spread, a few stifled laughs from the edges of the room where distant cousins realized they were witnessing history flip on its axis, and I leaned closer to the mic, letting my voice cut through the chaos. "You called me a wallet with a heartbeat. Well, the wallet just closed, and you signed it shut yourselves." The silence that followed was thick, punctured only by Matt stumbling forward, demanding it was a trick, grabbing for the journal, only to have my lawyer step from the back, holding the certified copies high, his voice calm as he confirmed everything in legal language that felt like nails being hammered into their coffins. The poetic sting wasn't just that they lost the wealth, the properties, the trust. It was that their greed had been their own undoing, that the very tradition they mocked was the mechanism of their ruin, and as the crowd dissolved into murmurs and stares, I saw something in my father's eyes for the first time: fear, the recognition that the son he had dismissed was not only stronger but untouchable. But the double twist, the part no one expected, came when I closed the journal, tucked the pen into my pocket, and announced, not that I was reclaiming the family empire, but dissolving it. I was selling the properties, liquidating the trust, and funneling every cent not into their pockets, but into a foundation for kids in Columbus who grew up like I did. Kids who had nothing but ambition and a cracked sidewalk under their shoes, and as gasps turned into shouts of disbelief, I felt lighter than I had in decades. They weren't just penniless now. They were irrelevant, cut out not by my vengeance alone, but by their own arrogance, by their blindness to the one detail that had been in front of them all along. And as I walked out into the cold night, the journal under my arm, I realized that revenge wasn't about punishing them anymore, it was about freeing myself. And in that freedom, I finally understood what legacy really meant. Not the money or the houses or even the name, but the choice to end a cycle of greed with one final, binding signature. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.